Hello, my dear audience, and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Micro. As always, I am so happy that you are here. And if this is your first time listening, welcome to the podcast and thank you for choosing it. And for the benefit of new listeners, sometimes I do episodes where I go over organisms, and sometimes I do episodes where I bring guests. And this time it is one of those where I'm going over organisms, and it is actually the second part of a series about Haemophilus. And we will go over some tests and also talk about susceptibilities and touch a little bit on the vaccine. More specifically, on a vaccine for Haemophilus influenza. Even though in the episode I am talking about the whole genus and I'm going over the different species, the vaccine is for Haemophilus influenza. So let's go ahead and dive into it. Well, by now we know examples of media in which Haemophilus can grow. And one important thing to remember is that Haemophilus does not grow in blood agar. And you remember why? And more specifically, sheep blood agar. And this is because of the requirement for the X and V factors. And those requirements will vary with the species, with Haemophilus influenza requiring both. Okay, and just real quick, if you're tuning in because you want to hear about, susceptibilities, about the ALA test, I also invite you to check out the previous episode where I went over the XMV factors, I went over different species, and I went over media. So if you want to learn about those as well, check out that episode. So let's continue going over today's episode. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about biochemicals. And during the course of this podcast, I'm sure that I have talked at some point in time about the importance of biochemicals. I also mentioned the importance of gram stains, and it is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. And this is because, as we get things like MALDI-TOF and gene sequencing, let's say, maybe we see the decrease in the use of gram stain and biochemicals. So maybe some of these, you might not be doing them in your lab. You might not be working with them as much as maybe you used to. Or if you're a recent graduate and this is your first facility where you have MALDI-TOF, you might not work with these at all, with some of these. But they are still very important. And this is something that I know I've mentioned before, either in talks or in the podcast, but with microbiology, you are building like a mental file and you are exposed to these organisms and you do a lot of repetition, right? You work with them many times over and you start doing gram stains, you do biochemicals, you put these organisms in instruments, and then the next day you come in or with MALDI-TOF, you see the ID right away and you start making those connections. And that is very important. And as I mentioned before, many things can go wrong with instruments. You can put the wrong organism in, you can scan the wrong patient, and then you don't know what the organism looks like. So it is very important for you to make that correlation. You don't want to be resulting something that it's inaccurate, right? So definitely make sure you correlate things and make sure that if you get that ID from the instrument, it makes sense, that the biochemicals match, that the morphology matches. Sometimes the morphology does not match or you have atypical biochemical results. But at the very least, when that happens, you have a strong foundation that you know that something is wrong. If it doesn't make sense, consult with someone, check with your supervisor, check with your director. But overall, build that file, that mental file, where you see the organisms with all the biochemicals and morphology. Remember that the goal of a good microbiologist is that by the time you're putting the organism in an instrument for an ID, you already have a pretty good idea what it is. And you are just trying to prove it. So remember that. And before I start going over biochemicals, just to kind of close the loop on the X and V factors, I mentioned media before, but there are actually discs that you can read literature where it says, that you can inoculate your organism on TSA, which is trypticase soy agar, and then you can place the disc, the X and V, and you can do it like that. But there's commercial media out there that has the X and V factors. Okay, so when it comes to testing for Haemophilus, you have fermentation of sugars, and then for biochemicals, you have catalase and indole. As far as catalase, Haemophilus influenza, Aegyptus, and Haemolyticus are catalase positive. Haemophilus, parahemolyticus, and parainfluenza are variable. And this means that, you can have some strains that are catalase positive, some that are catalase negative. And then H. ducreyi is catalase negative. And then when it comes to catalase, you might not be using it as much, especially if you have Vitek, if you have Molotov, you might be using the indole more. Or maybe you're doing the ALA test to rule out Haemophilus influenza, which I will be talking more about the ALA test. But those are the results for catalase. And then for indole, when it comes to Haemophilus influenza and parainfluenza, the reaction is based on the biotype. And you remember biotypes, right? And then for Haemophilus aegyptus and parahemolyticus, and also Ducrey, the indole result is negative. Haemophilus hemolyticus is indole variable. And then we have the urease test. And for that, once again, for Haemophilus influenza and parainfluenza, the reaction is based on the biotype. For Haemophilus aegyptus, parahemolyticus, and hemolyticus, the urease is positive. And then for Haemophilus ducrei, the urease result is negative. Okay, so I have mentioned the ALA test by now, right? And I know that some of you that are listening, you have performed it. And do you remember it? I know I remember it when I was doing my clinical rotations and maybe early on in my career. However, by the time that I was trained in respiratory cultures, it was gone in my facility because we had Molotov, and so it wasn't needed anymore. But I do remember it. And I am sure that by now it's coming to mind if you actually perform it, and this is something that you used to do more than likely in a respiratory bench, or if you work with respiratory cultures like sputum, for example. So you were scanning your cultures and then looking at that chocolate plate, and then if you saw something that looked like like 10 colonies, and maybe you did a gram stain and you saw the gram-negative coccobacilli, you went ahead and performed this ALA test. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Well, this test is used to detect enzymes that convert delta aminolevulinic acid, ALA, into porphyrins. And how does this relate to Haemophilus? Well, species that require the X factor, or the term X factor dependent, such as Haemophilus influenza, they lack the enzymes to do this. So therefore, a positive test was used to rule out Haemophilus influenza. The test can be performed in broth, agar, or a disc. So the broth method requires the preparation of porphyrin broth, and then that broth is inoculated with the organism, and then incubated at 35 degrees for 4 hours in a non-CO2 incubator, or at ambient air. So those are a couple terms that when you're reading the literature, and maybe if you're a brand new tech and you hear, okay, ambient air or non-CO2, it's the same. Then after those 4 hours, the broth is examined for brick red fluorescence using an UV lamp. If results are questionable, then the broth can be incubated for up to 24 hours. Alternatively, Kovacs reagent can be added and then observed for a red color. So let's go ahead and talk about the disc method. And when I was telling you the listeners, if you remember this, and the one that I remember was the one that was the disc method. So maybe that is the one that you remember as well. So let's go ahead and talk about it. So, and more specifically, I am going over the Remel ALA disc. The disc is impregnated with ALA, which is, do you want me to say it again? Well, I'll give it a shot. Delta aminolevulinic acid. And the setup is simple. You place a disc on agar, or a petri dish, and then you rehydrate the disc with 40 microliters of sterile water. After that, you inoculate the disc with the heavy inoculum of the suspected colony. And something very important to remember with this is that you check the morphology and do a gram stain. Make sure that the organism that you are placing matches the morphology and the gram stain of Haemophilus. Something very important during the incubation period is that you need to keep the moisture going. So you place a moist filter paper in the lid of the petri dish. Once you have done this, incubate the plate at 35 to 37 degrees for 6 hours in a non-CO2 incubator or ambient air. After an hour of incubation, you can examine it using an UV light. If negative, then you return it to the incubator and examine it periodically during those 6 hours. And you're looking for bright orange fluorescence. So a positive test is if you see this bright orange fluorescence, and a negative is if it doesn't fluoresce. So if you're remembering this, if you did this, right, you remember that. So you were hoping for fluorescence, because if it didn't fluoresce, that then, it meant that you possibly had Haemophilus influenza. But if you saw the fluorescence, that meant that it was negative for Haemophilus influenza. So I don't know how much it is currently being used in the United States. Maybe it is more used in other parts of the world, but in the labs here in the States, as more and more are getting Malditoff, it's probably being phased out. So, but I am not sure. Okay, so let's briefly talk about identification systems for Haemophilus. So I have mentioned the Vitek. I have mentioned Malditoff MS. So when it comes to Vitek, there's an identification card called the NH card. And it is used for the identification of Neisseria, Haemophilus, and other organisms that are fastidious, one of them being Eikenella. The one downside when it comes to this card is that you need a heavy inoculum. You need a McFarland of 2.7 to between 2.7 and 3.3. So that's a heavy inoculum. So that means that if you are using this, you have the suspect colonies, you're probably going to have to sub it to a chocolate plate so you have enough for the next day. And this is because, if you have a respiratory sample like a sputum, you're going to have a lot of oropharyngeal flora. So those colonies are not going to be nice and isolated and pure. So you're going to have to sub it, and then the next day do the testing on this NH card. And then you get the identification the next day. There is also a BBL crystal Neisseria Haemophilus ID system from Becton Dickinson, or BD. And there is also a rapid NH system. And those, that's like a whole topic by itself. And I want to do an episode one day. And those of you that have been doing this for a while, I'm sure you're familiar with this rapid systems. There was one for Corynebacterium, there was one for anaerobes, there's one for NH. And they typically, they take, you incubate them for 4 hours. And it involves making a suspension, placing it in the test, incubating it, and then you add some reagents. The reactions, they give you a number. You have a combination of numbers, and then you check that with the database. And I mean, they seem cost effective, especially if you cannot have a MALDI in your lab. However, and I have mentioned this before, the issue I have with this, these rapid tests is that sometimes, as you are getting your reactions, you're recording and you're like, okay, maybe this is a positive or a negative, because you record your reactions and then maybe the number, you put the number in the database and you don't get an ID. And then you go back to your test and you're like, okay, maybe this reaction was positive instead of negative. So you adjust that, you adjust the numbers, and then you get an ID. So that's one of the things that I don't like. But that is a topic for a different day. With Malditoff, you don't require as much organisms. So you see that colony in your chocolate, you can touch a little bit, put it on the slide, and you can get an ID. So that's a great advantage of having Malditoff, which of course is Malditoff MS. I'm just shortening it, but it is Malditoff MS. And I mentioned that Haemophilus influenza, right? One of the as far as pathogenesis, one of the diseases that it is seen on is meningitis. And of course, you remember the organisms that we have covered here in letstalkmicro that cause meningitis, or that they are seen in meningitis. Well, let's mention them again real quick, and then we'll continue with the episode. Streptococcus agalactiae, Streptococcus pneumoniae, Listeria, and now Haemophilus influenza. There's also E. coli, there's also Neisseria meningitidis, but I haven't done episodes about those. So since in this, this organism can be seen in meningitis, and you can also see it in bacteremia, you have molecular systems that identify it. And with these systems, you don't have to grow the organism. You can place, let's say, your cerebrospinal fluid or your blood. You can set them on the instruments and then get an ID. And some examples of these are from bioMérieux, you have the BioFire system, which has the meningitis encephalitis panel. And also there's the BioFire BCID 2 panel. And that one is for blood cultures. And then from Roche, There's the E-plex gram-negative panel for blood, which can identify Haemophilus influenza. And these test systems that I have mentioned that are for blood samples, like the BCID and the E-plex, they also have targets for those other organisms that we have covered here in the podcast that are seen in meningitis. Okay, so now that we have talked about media, biochemicals, and instruments used for identifying Haemophilus, let's go ahead and talk about susceptibilities. When it comes to resistance, Haemophilus influenza produces two beta-lactamases, and those are TEM1 and ROB1. And in the lab, you can test for beta-lactamases, and I'm sure that if you work in a lab in microbiology, you have done this test. An example of this is the use of cephinase disc. And the use of this disc, is not only for Haemophilus, but for other organisms that produce beta-lactamases. And this disc, it's very easy to use. What you do is you place it on a clean slide, then you moisten with water, then you apply the colony to the disc. And I always suggest that you do this in more than one place. That way, if you have a questionable reaction, if you think you have a positive, you look at both spots or the multiple spots, and then you can confirm this. So this disc is impregnated with a cephalosporin substrate called nitrocephin. The organism that is a beta-lactamase producer hydrolyzes the beta-lactam ring of nitrocephin, and this produces cephalosporanic acid. This hydrolysis causes a color change from yellow, which is the color of the disc, to pink. Beta-lactamase producing strains should be considered resistant to ampicillin and amoxicillin. And I wanted to share something that I learned while I was preparing for this episode. There are some strains of Haemophilus influenza that are beta-lactamase negative and have high MICs, which is minimum inhibitory concentrations, to ampicillin. So they are beta-lactamase negative and have high MICs to ampicillin. And these are called beta-lactamase negative ampicillin resistant strains, BLNAR. And this is due to altered penicillin binding proteins. Okay, so when it comes to breakpoints and things like media selection, incubation temperatures, recommended, antibiotics, as always, I refer you to the CLSI. In this case, for Haemophilus influenza and parainfluenza, the CLSI M100, and then for other species of Haemophilus, the CLSI M100 refers you to the CLSI M45. So let's go ahead and talk about the CLSI M100. So for Haemophilus influenza and parainfluenza, there is a disc diffusion method and a broth dilution method. I will be talking a little bit about the disc diffusion method. And one difference from, and if you work with susceptibility, if you do susceptibility testing, one difference when it comes to Haemophilus is that instead of Mueller-Hinton agar, the CLSI recommends HTM agar, which is Haemophilus test medium. And this is recommended for all agents. And then when it comes to select agents, there is the recommendation of Mueller-Hinton with 5% mechanically defibrinated horse blood. And as I said, check out the CLSI M100 for all recommended agents. And there is a recommendation of not putting more than 9 discs on a 150 millimeter plate and 4 on a 100 millimeter plate. And this Haemophilus test medium, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about it. It has Mueller-Hinton agar as the base, but it also has casein, hemin, beef extract, all the good stuff needed for fastidious organisms. And of course, it also has NAD and hematin, since Haemophilus influenza needs them for growth. And those of you that prepare suspensions for susceptibility testing, I am sure that you're familiar with Mueller-Hinton broth and of course with saline. And those are the two recommended liquid mediums to prepare the suspensions. And there are several manufacturers of Haemophilus test medium or HTM. And the setup is simple. Once the discs have been applied to the agar, you incubate it in a non-CO2 incubator for a full 16 to 18 hours before reading. So just to recap all the things that we have talked about, we mentioned the ALA test, which is used to, a positive result rule out Haemophilus influenza, because since Haemophilus influenza is X factor dependent, it does not have the enzymes to convert ALA to porphyrins. So during the test, you do not see fluorescence for Haemophilus influenza. And then, you can identify it with Vitek, Malditov MS. There's a rapid NH system. BD has another system. And of course, you have molecular systems, for blood and cerebrospinal fluid that can detect it, that can identify it from the actual sample, whether it's blood or cerebrospinal fluid. So you don't have to grow the organism and then test it. You can put the sample, the biological sample. And then when it comes to susceptibility testing, refer to the CLSI. And then there's this medium called Haemophilus test medium, which has Muller-Hinton agar, but has other things like the X and V factors. So Haemophilus influenza can grow. Okay, so let's finish this episode by talking a little bit about vaccines. And I know that this is a heated topic, there's many opinions out there. So the point of me talking about them is not to steer anything, it's just, I'm mentioning what I found and what is available. So as I mentioned in the previous episode, there are capsular types of Haemophilus influenza, and those are letter A through F. The vaccine is for type B. So when it comes to the vaccines, I am talking about Haemophilus influenza specifically. And according to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, there are 5 vaccines available in the US. And out of those 5, 3 are for Haemophilus influenza type B only. Out of those 3, 1 involves, has 3 shots, and the other 2 have 4. And they are given to children from the age of 2 months all the way through 15 months. And they can be given as early as 6 weeks. Then there are 2 combination vaccines. So with these, you are combining vaccinations for more than one agent. For example, if you have, let's say you have a vaccine for Haemophilus only, you have a vaccine for tetanus only, then a combination vaccine will be for those 2, for both tetanus and Haemophilus. Overall, vaccines for Haemophilus influenza type B are recommended for children younger than 5 years. And for more information, refer to the CDC website, which I am including in the show notes. Well, that is the episode, my dear audience, so thank you so much for listening and for tuning in. And of course, you can find the podcast in any podcast platform. So Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, GoodPods, whatever you listen to podcasts, you can find Let's Talk Micro. You can find Let's Talk Micro on social media, on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and Blue Sky Social as Let's Talk Micro, on X as Let's Talk Micro 1, on LinkedIn as Luis Plaza. And there is also an email address, which is letstalkmicro@outlook.com. So either via social media or via email, you can reach out with any suggestions, any feedback. Those are always welcome and appreciated. And I invite you to subscribe to the podcast, download episodes, and if the app allows you to do so, please go ahead and leave a review. And Let's Talk Micro does not have any sponsors, so if you want to support the podcast in any way, you can do so via a Venmo link or via Buy Me a Coffee, KOFI, both links available on the show notes. And if you're looking to learn more about antibiotics, please check out www.learnantibiotics.com and the Learn Antibiotics book available on Amazon. These resources include cheat sheets, practice tests, games, and more, and they are being used by thousands of people worldwide and may be helpful for you or your colleagues. And these are some great resources from Dr. Timothy Gauthier, a very passionate pharmacist. And the Let's Talk Micro podcast is supported by the American Society for Microbiology. To learn more about microbes, visit asm.org. And that, my dear audience, is the end of this episode. I hope you enjoy learning about Haemophilus, about ALA, about susceptibilities. As always, I enjoy sharing this information with you. Thank you so much for your support. Stay tuned. Great things coming your way. And hey, if you're going to be in ASM Microbe in Los Angeles, this year, stop by, say hi. I'm looking forward to meeting you and connecting with you. So please continue bringing that passion to what you do. It is so important. You do such great work. So, as always, stay motivated, stay safe, and of course, continue talking micro. Until the next time. Bye.